Welcome back to the channel, everyone, and welcome to spring training. I hope everyone's enjoying the start of the baseball season. For me, spring training always kind of marked the end or the upcoming end of winter and the beginning of spring, and the sort of the rebirth of my collecting interest in baseball, because often my interest would move away from that time from collecting football or even basketball and moving back to the new products that were being released when I was much younger in my collecting days, when I was still in grade school and becoming a teenager, when I took a break from the hobby for a few years before I came back to it in college. But I wanted to talk a little bit about how my collecting has changed, especially my collecting of vintage cards. It's been 2 years this weekend since I've been on YouTube, and during that time, my approach to collecting at least has changed quite a bit. And I also wanted to kind of even go back to when I really started doing a deep dive into getting vintage cards about over 20 years ago, and kind of talk a little bit how my collection has evolved since that time. But before I get into that, I want to just be able to kind of highlight, I did a video over this weekend that should be out pretty soon. I did a recording. I was a guest on Dan's Vintage Cards. We spent the hour talking about the 1964 Topps Giant sets, a set that I recently completed and shared with you guys on my channel. But we're going to do a little bit of deep dive into some of the players on the set, the cards themselves, and share each individual's collection, because he also had a full complete set too. So that's partially why you see the 64 Giants pictured behind you at this point. So look for that. I'll put the link to his channel in my description. So hope you enjoy that show and enjoy the rest of the content on his channel. It looks like he's got some wonderful stuff, and the few things that I've watched so far I've really enjoyed. All right, so getting to my topic at hand. So 2 years ago, I put my first video out, and the first card that I featured was this Mini Minoso, the 1952 Bowman. But I had been into vintage much earlier than that, going back to the late 90s, early 2000s, and when eBay was starting to come around, when I was starting to purchase some cards. For me, when I was younger, they felt very unattainable, and everything was a Beckett book price. And when you go to card shows often, and as we know, those didn't actually reflect kind of the real market once eBay came online, and you started to see prices go for much different than they were in the Beckett guides. And grading started to come on the scene too, to be able to kind of verify both authenticity of the cards, but also the condition of the cards themselves too. Condition of the cards was always an important thing in the hobby, but this was always that third-party opinion that kind of took negotiation out of it in some ways, when you're kind of like dealing with somebody, and really began to develop those tiers, price tiers within a card itself that Beckett was trying to capture. But this kind of helped really kind of refine it further by having a third party kind of come in and say, this card is a what, this card is a, and this one is a this. But kind of talking about, but 20 years ago, 25 years ago, even at this point now, so I'm going to take down the Minoso here and kind of talk about some of the early vintage cards. When I first got into it, I was just happy to get the card. So I was just thrilled to have like a 52 Topps cards. This was the very first one I got. This was a Connie Ryan. I think I wanted at auction, either on like Beckett's site. I think Beckett had a little bit of a bidding site, I think, at that time, but definitely eBay did as well. So I think it was like one of the first ones I was able to pick up. It's in terrible shape, so it's one I wouldn't necessarily grade. It's probably a 2 at best. But for me, it was just exciting to have a card from this iconic set, which kind of really captured how I collected in my early years. I was just happy to be able to get the card regardless of sort of the grade that I eventually would get. Perfect example of this is one I recently graded, was this Duke Schneider, which is one I had from my childhood, which had writing on it, which within itself would have brought the grade down, but then it also had an eraser mark on here that kind of tried to remove the center field writing that was on there, that did mark where position he played for the Brooklyn Dodgers at this point, but further damaged the card. But I recently had it encapsulated just because I wanted to kind of add it to my graded card collection, and it kind of meant something for me, because it was like one of the first few vintage cards I got in my collection, one that stayed with me for all this time. And so it meant something to me. It meant something to me to kind of still have it. And I thought it looked better kind of just slabbed up than it did just kind of sitting in a top loader. So early on, during that time period, I was, again, just happy to get the cards. And as I kind of evolved into college years, I was starting to pick up some players that I was reading about. So Like, I wanted a card of Hal Chase just because I was reading about his role as one of the players who's been banned from baseball history and his involvement with gambling and even his knowledge of the 1919 World Series. And I thought it'd be kind of cool to get one of his cards. And so I was able to get this on eBay pretty affordably. I think I paid less than $10 for the card, and it may not be worth that much more either in graded condition. But I thought it was kind of cool to have a piece of history. So I just wanted to be able to kind of, at that time, get cards that helped me remember the things that I was reading and helped capture some of the history that I was finding very interesting about baseball, which at that time was a lot around the turn of the century. It was nearing the 100th anniversary of the World Series, and so there was a lot of books coming out that time about like the beginning of the American League and the start of the World Series, and Hal Chase was a name that was kind of mentioned in a lot of those early texts. So it was a card I wanted to be able to pick up. Similar, I was also at the same time exploring some of the other sets that were available and trying to find cards from some of these players that I was reading about. Now, this one I'm going to show you was less about me learning about the player and wanting to get I think I learned more about the player after I purchased it than I did before it. But I was looking at the set and it had all those players that were retired that were at that time, some I think had even been in the Hall of Fame, but many were going to be future Hall of Famers. But it also had active players in there too that later became Hall of Famers. And I think in particular, I was kind of looking up some of those players that played at the turn of the century and trying to find cards that could at some point be in my collection, even though I never really aggressively pursued them at that point. But this is one I was able to find, I think at that time for like $15. I won an auction or something like that. Fortunately enough, when I was submitted for grading, it came back a 4 because the centering is like dead on. Even though the edges are a little bit rounded and the corners as well, but the registration on the card itself, the image is very clear. It doesn't have any marks really on the front of the card apart from wear and tear on the corners and edges. And it's just a beautiful example from the 40 play ball set. But for me, it was more about like getting a card from the set and getting a card of a Hall of Famer. And so I think I even picked up a few more cards from this set, but they were in Hall of Famers and they're in like terrible condition. But at that time, for me, it was just about obtaining the card. So then I was building sets for a while, and I was working on sets from the 80s, 90s, or sorry, the 80s and 70s, and I started working even on the 60s. So that was kind of my focus. And I was putting those sets together. I was just more about trying to get the card. And if I had gotten a lot that had a card in there that had some wear on it, even if it was a common, if I hadn't gotten that card previously, I often just kept it in the set. And that's something I don't really do now when I'm building sets. And so I kind of like, if I see a card that's in really bad shape, even if I need it, I don't typically keep it unless it's a card that's really hard to obtain. It's kind of been the ways I've kind of changed. But I did carry that sort of feeling about just getting the card into my early days of kind of returning to the hobby. And I have some cards that kind of illustrate that. So like my 56 Topps Jackie Robinson, looks like it was run over by a truck. The surface has tons of scratches all over it. All the corners are significantly rounded on here, and the edges are almost missing on the card because they've been worn down so much. The back is very easy to read, so that part kind of still stands up pretty well. But the front of the card looks awful. It's in a BVG1. So it's about as low of a grade as you can get. And it's a card at some point I kind of regretted getting because I thought I moved too quickly to get a Jackie Robinson card. This was, I think, shortly before the beginning of the pandemic, and his cards were starting to get expensive. So I wanted to jump on getting one before it was too late. And this is the one I picked up, and in hindsight, I would like to get a better copy of it, and I probably will at some point in my collection. But I also didn't stop doing that. I did that for a little while. So I would start getting like vintage card lots that were often in poor condition. So this mini Minoso, it's hard to see it right now, but there's a crease that goes all the way down from top to bottom in the center of the card, and it's miscut too. As you can see, it has parts of the other card that was probably next to it on the sheet. So this card is like far from what I would want to be able to get in my collection. I haven't replaced the mini yet, but when I do, this one's going to go by the wayside because I'm not really happy with it now. I want to get cards that look nicer, even if they are lower grade, than like ones that are really poor ones. If I put this in for grading, I'm sure that's all it would come back as. might even come back as altered of how bad it's been beat up. Another card that kind of also captures that is this Hal Newhouser from the 53 top set. It's a really cool card, but this one's got huge creases in it. It's got card paper loss on the front of the card. It's got scratches all over it. The back reads pretty well. That's not so much an issue with the card, but you know, it's just not what I kind of want. You know, if this was maybe the Mickey Mantle in the set, I might be happy with it because I also want to strike that balance between what I can afford and what I think looks nice. But the Hal Newhouser, I could spend a little bit more and get a much better copy. And at some point, I want to be able to do it. I think I just got excited seeing it at the time for the price it was. And, you know, I wasn't as picky as I later became. The final example of this was I picked up an Eddie Collins quickly back when I got into the hobby here in the about 2019, 2020-ish time. And this Gaudy version of Eddie Collins is just, you know, very beat up. It's creased. It's got staining throughout the entirety of the card. It's got paper loss on it as well. So in every way, it earned this A. And it's almost impossible to read the back, even with a loop. You can kind of make out some of it, but a lot of it's just kind of been either stained over completely where it's not readable, or it's been worn through, probably from getting wet at some point and losing some of its integrity and having the part of the writing kind of come off from the card. So, you know, like reflecting on these, I mean, I don't regret getting either of the two cards in my collection in hindsight. But I do kind of regret not being more patient to get a better copy of these cards. So over the last few years, I would say I've been a little bit more cognizant of it, and I've even started getting into grading too. So I'm going to show you some examples of like ones that I was beginning to start reflecting a little bit more how I'm like trying to find cards. So, you know, I have two cards that I picked up in the same transaction 2 years ago. Now, is this card completely centered? No. In fact, that's the one thing that deters from it. But what I liked about it at the time is it didn't have any creasing on it, didn't have any marks on it. The registration of the image itself was very good. The borders itself were still white. They hadn't been colored from age or exposure. And for the most part, the edges were pretty sharp, even though the corners were a little bit rounded, and the back was very easy to be able to read, even though it had a little bit of a stain from old wax. So this is when I submitted in for grading, and I was very happy it came back as a 3, and I wasn't surprised it came back a 3 really either. But this is kind of an example of where I think, you know, I'm happy with still some lower grades, but I want to make sure it doesn't have like major creases over it, writing all over it, paper loss and things of that nature. I want to be able to still see the card itself. So that's kind of an example of where I started to shift a little bit even at that time. And with the same purchase, I even got this one, which also came back from grading recently, was the Ted Williams All-Star. And this one, I was pretty pleased with this, not so much the centering, but like the edges and the corners were very sharp and clean. The back was very clean. It had a little bit of snowing on the image itself, and it's obviously off-center, so it was far from perfect, but this is a card I thought would still present well in my collection, and I was happy to be able to kind of have it graded and come back a 5.5. Another example of kind of where I've been going to is in another purchase that I did a little bit later, was picking up this Yogi Berra and later getting it graded. Yeah, is it far from perfect? Yeah, it's a 3.5, but you know, like it's a very solid 3.5. It's centered. It's got good registration. I mean, yeah, the corners have some chipping, so you lost some of the image there, but the edges still are pretty clean. And the back is still very clean and legible. You know, it's a little off-center from one side to the other. But, you know, like there's nothing wrong with this Yogi Berra, and there's nothing wrong with having it in my collection, unless I was trying to really try and get a high-grade 53 top set, which that won't really be in my price range. So I'm very happy with it. And in the same purchase, even though it came back a 2, the Harmon Killebrew rookie card, yeah, it's off center, and there's a little bit of a small crease that's hard to see. You probably can't even see it on the camera itself. But I was really happy with the card itself when I kind of had it in my hand before I submitted in for grading. Yeah, is it perfectly centered? No, but you know, like that's what kind of made it the perfect price point for me. I was able to get a lower price on it and submit it in for grading, and probably would pay less to do that, getting it raw and grading it, than I would have actually like bought the cart in a tube. And kind of more recently, I've been trying to target more like key sets and items that I want to kind of pick up in my collection. And, you know, that's kind of like trying to get nice looking 52 Topps cards. You know, like I'm okay if it's Hall of Famers or not Hall of Famers, as long as they're in good condition. I want to be able to kind of then submit some of the better ones in for grading. This is one I already bought graded, but I was happy to kind of add a Billy Pierce, obviously, into my set because of the connection with the White Sox. And as you know, I'm still working on sets, and I definitely can talk more about those in other videos, and I share those as soon as I get those. But I'm also trying to get like other cards from other iconic sets. Like I hadn't had a Leaf until I picked up this Ewell Blackwell, and it's in great condition, apart from it just centering. That's really kind of the major issue on the card itself, and it will be one that kind of goes in for grading when I drop it off at SGC for grading at the next card show that I attend. So I like how my collecting has kind of continued to evolve, and I've added in some really exciting cards in my collections and from some key sets that I've been working on. And I like that I've been able to share those with people on YouTube the last couple years, and I love being able to be part of the community and join live streams and meet people in person. It's been a lot of fun, and if I were to give anybody kind of thinking about getting into vintage cards or creating a YouTube a little bit of advice, is try to figure out your focus. And some of it is just to get started. For me, it was just needing to get started, and I've been able to find a little bit of a focus of like the things I like to be able to put out there for people to see in the hobby. And I hope people are enjoying the content. Don't get discouraged if you don't get a lot of likes on videos. I found out that some of the videos that continue to do well over time are the ones that I maybe didn't spend a lot of time on, and the ones that I spend a lot of time on don't get as many watches. Don't get too discouraged with that. The more quality you put out there, over time it will get noticed and people will watch it. So again, it's easy to get discouraged not seeing a lot of subscribers initially and not getting a lot of likes on your videos, but it will get better. But if you're getting into it for the right reasons, because you think it's fun and you think you have something to offer to the community, you can't go wrong with that. And then finally, like with jumping into vintage cards itself, certainly it can be a huge rabbit hole that one can get lost in. For me, it was helpful to have a focus, like focusing in on like a getting stand musical cards or building a specific set is like a perfect example of how I was able to get more focused. Otherwise, you could just go on eBay and look at all the things that are coming up, ending on auction, that are vintage card, and just try to find the deals and put in best offers. And you just have you may have a really broad collection, but it may not have a focus that you want it to have in time. So I think if you can kind of come into it with a focus, like I'm going to get the 1960 Topps set, or I want to work on the 1948-49 Leaf set, it can help really make it not feel so overwhelming, especially when you're going to card shows where there's cases full of cards from vintage to modern. When I go into shows, I look at more like I'm looking for targeting specific things that are like vintage sets that I'm kind of worked on, or a vintage card that I want to be able to pick up. It helps me get around the shows much faster and takes away that feeling of being overwhelmed, which I think it could be universally shared for a lot of people who've gone to things like the National, if you go in there with that kind of a focus. But as long as you're enjoying it, and as long as you're doing it responsibly with your finances, you really can't go wrong no matter how you're doing it. So I'll be back soon, and thank you all very much for supporting the channel, and I look forward to starting year 3 of everyone.